My brothers and sisters, many times unusual questions come up in our communities and people are shy to ask. One such question is, if a husband drinks his wife's breast milk, does this affect the nikah? Does it create fosterage, or is it something that can even break the marriage? Today, we will look at what Islam really says about this matter. Remember, Islam is a religion of clarity, balance, and wisdom. So before jumping to conclusions, let us understand the guidance of the Qur'an, the Sunnah, and our scholars. In Islam, the relationship between husband and wife is sacred, built on love, mercy, and respect. Naturally, questions arise about what is permissible and what may affect the validity of the marriage, nikah. One such sensitive question is whether a husband drinking his wife's breast milk impacts the marriage contract or changes the ruling of nikah. To answer this, we must turn to the current hadith scholarly interpretations. Firstly, it is important to understand the concept of raḍā, fosterage through breastfeeding in Islamic law. According to the Qur'an, as Surah An, Nisa 4:2-3, certain family relationships are established through breastfeeding, which then prohibit marriage between those individuals. For example, if a baby is breastfed by a woman 5 or more times before the age of 2, according to many scholars, that woman becomes his foster mother and her children become his foster siblings. This ruling is clear for infants and young children, but does it apply to adults? The majority of scholars, including those of the 4 main schools of thought, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, agree that breastfeeding rulings only apply to infants under 2 years old. Once a child passes the age of weaning, breastfeeding does not establish fosterage or invalidate a marriage. This is based on authentic hadith where the Prophet said breastfeeding is only valid in the first 2 years, Ibn Majah, Abu Dawud. Therefore, if a husband were to drink his wife's breast milk, it would not create a foster relationship and would not invalidate the nikah. The act itself is considered makruh, discouraged, because breast milk is nourishment that Allah created for infants, not adults. Some scholars also note that it can be seen as disrespectful if done intentionally or out of desire, but from a purely legal standpoint, it does not break the marriage contract. However, there is one notable scholarly opinion to mention. A hadith narrated about the incident of Salim, the freed slave, states that the Prophet allowed him to be breastfed by a woman even though he was grown, in order to establish a non-mahram relationship. Some scholars, such as Imam Ibn Hazm, argued that this shows breastfeeding could apply to adults. But the majority of scholars considered this a special exception for Salim's case and not a general rule. In conclusion, Islamic ruling is clear. A husband drinking his wife's breast milk does not invalidate the nikah. It does not create fosterage, nor does it affect the lawful marital relationship. While the act itself is discouraged and unnecessary, it carries no legal consequences for the marriage. What matters most is preserving respect, intimacy, and dignity between husband and wife, as these are the true foundations of a blessed marriage in Islam. One of the key questions regarding a husband drinking his wife's breast milk is whether this act creates fosterage, raḍā in Islamic law. Fosterage through breastfeeding is a serious matter in Islam because it establishes new family ties that are legally binding. If fosterage is established, certain people become permanently unlawful mahram for marriage, just as blood relations are. Therefore, it is necessary to carefully examine whether adult breastfeeding creates this kind of relationship or not. The Qur'an makes it clear that breastfeeding establishes kinship, but it is specifically tied to infants. Allah says, your mothers who breastfed you, your sisters through breastfeeding. So Surah An, Nisa 4:23, this verse confirms that the prohibition of marriage applies to those who have been breastfed. But the Qur'an does not specify the exact age limit. For that, we turn to the Sunnah of the Prophet A. According to authentic hadith, the Prophet A clearly stated that fosterage is only established when breastfeeding occurs within the first 2 years of life. For example, the Prophet A said, breastfeeding is only valid within the period of 2 years. Ibn Majah, Abu Dawud, this hadith is the foundation upon which the majority of scholars, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, base their ruling. They agree that once a child has passed the age of 2, some scholars say 2.5, breastfeeding no longer creates fosterage. With this in mind, if a husband drinks his wife's breast milk, it does not create fosterage because he is a fully grown adult. His relationship with his wife is already defined by nikah, and drinking milk does not alter that relationship. Thus, it does not make the wife his foster mother, nor does it invalidate their marriage. However, a well-known incident raises a discussion among scholars. The case of Salim, the freed slave, is recorded in Sahih Muslim, where the Prophet allowed him as an adult be braced by the wife of Abu Hudayfa so that he could freely enter their home. Some scholars like Ibn Hazm use this as evidence that adult breastfeeding can establish fosterage. But the overwhelming consensus of scholars considered this a unique situation specific to Salim and not a general rule for all Muslims. Aisha's Ray held the view that adult breastfeeding could establish fosterage, but the majority of the Prophet's wives disagreed with her and supported the opinion that it only applies to infants. Therefore, Islamic law concludes that a husband drinking his wife's milk does not establish fosterage raya. It carries no legal impact on their relationship, nor does it make the marriage invalid. At most, scholars consider it an act of bad manners or distasteful, since breast milk is meant for infants, not adults. In summary, fosterage through breastfeeding is restricted to young children within 2 years of age. Adult breastfeeding, whether by accident or intention, does not create foster relationships and does not affect nikah. Islam protects the sanctity of marriage, and such matters must be understood with balanced knowledge and respect. The question of whether a husband drinking his wife's breast milk affects their marriage, irika, or creates fosterage raḍā, has been discussed by scholars across the centuries. While the majority of Islamic jurists agree on the core ruling, there are nuanced differences in interpretation, primarily due to varying approaches to the hadith and the incident of Salim, the freed slave. Understanding these scholarly opinions helps us see the balance and depth of Islamic jurisprudence. The majority opinion, the vast majority of scholars, including those from the four main schools of Islamic jurisprudence, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, agree that adult breastfeeding does not create fosterage and does not invalidate nikah. They base their view on authentic hadith from the Prophet which clearly limit the rulings of fosterage to infants under the age of 2. The hadith states breastfeeding is only valid in the first 2 years. Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah, this forms the cornerstone of the majority's position. They argue that since the husband is an adult, the act of drinking his wife's breast milk has no legal impact on their relationship. It may be considered unnecessary or even distasteful, but it does not affect the validity of the marriage contract. The minority opinion, Aisha's view, there is, however, a minority view based on the incident of Salim, the freed slave, as narrated in Sahih Muslim. Salim was allowed by the Prophet to be breathed by the wife of Abu Hudafa so that he could freely enter the household without causing issues of non-mahram interaction. From this narration, Aisha Zayd understood that adult breastfeeding could create fosterage. She held this view and even encouraged her relatives to apply it. Response of other wives of the Prophet, however, the other wives of the Prophet, disagreed with Aisha's interpretation. They argued that the incident of Salim was a unique exception to a very specific situation and was not intended as a general ruling for the Ummah. Most scholars support this perspective, affirming that rulings should be based on the Prophet's general teachings rather than a unique circumstance. Ibn Hazm's literalist approach, the Zahiri scholar Ibn Hazm, also supported the idea that adult breastfeeding could create fosterage, taking a very literal approach to the text without restricting it to age. However, his view did not gain wide acceptance among mainstream scholars, contradicted the majority of hadith evidence and the consensus of early jurists. Contemporary scholars, modern scholars, also overwhelmingly follow the majority view. Adult breastfeeding does not create fosterage and does not affect nikah. They emphasize that Islam is a religion of clarity and ease, and rulings related to family and marriage are not meant to create unnecessary hardship. While there are historical differences of opinion, the dominant and reliable position is that a husband drinking his wife's breast milk does not invalidate the marriage or create fosterage. The differences highlight the depth of Islamic scholarship, but also the importance of following the stronger consensus when it comes to sensitive issues like marriage and family. Marriage in Islam is not just a contract between two people, it is a sacred covenant, Amithakan Gals, and that Allah describes as one of the most blessed bonds in life. It is built on love, mawadda, mercy, rahmah, and mutual respect. When questions arise, such as whether a husband drinking his wife's breast milk affects their relationship, it is important to look beyond the legal technicalities and reflect on the spiritual purpose of marriage, preserving its sanctity and harmony. The purpose of marriage in Islam, Allah says in the Qur'an, and among His signs is that He created for you spouses from among yourselves so that you may find tranquility in them, and He placed between you affection and mercy. So Surah Rum 3021 of this verse highlights that the essence of marriage is sakina, peace, mawadda's love, and rahma's mercy. Any act that undermines respect, dignity, or intimacy between husband and wife goes against the purpose of marriage. Thus, while scholars may debate the legal ruling of breastfeeding between spouses, the greater priority is to protect the dignity and sacredness of the marital bond. Respecting boundaries in intimacy, Islam permits intimacy between spouses in many forms, as long as it remains within the boundaries set by Sharia. However, it also emphasizes modesty, respect, and purposefulness in the marital relationship. Breast milk is a provision Allah created for infants, not for adults. While the act of a husband drinking his wife's milk does not invalidate the nikah, scholars generally discourage it because it blurs the natural purpose of what Allah has designated for children. Preserving sanctity means ensuring that intimacy enhances love, not confusion or disrespect. Avoiding unnecessary doubts. One of the objectives of Islamic rulings is to prevent doubts and unnecessary disputes. Couples engage in practices that raise sensitive questions like breastfeeding. Between adults, it can cause confusion, shame, or even arguments. This may affect trust and harmony in the marriage. By avoiding doubtful matters, couples protect their relationship from unnecessary cracks. The Prophet said, "Leave that which makes you doubt for that which does not make you doubt." See Tirmidhi applying this principle. Even though such an act does not break nikah, avoiding it is better for maintaining peace of mind and sanctity in the marriage. Focusing on what strengthens the bond rather than engaging in acts that cause confusion, couples should focus on what strengthens their love and faith together, praying in congregation, making dua for one another, supporting each other's emotional and spiritual growth, and practicing kindness daily. These actions truly preserve the sanctity of marriage and ensure that it remains a source of blessing. Preserving the sanctity of marriage means honoring the purpose Allah intended for it: love, peace, and mercy. While a husband drinking his wife's breast milk does not legally affect nikah or create fosterage, it is discouraged as it goes against the natural purpose of breast milk and may cause discomfort or doubts. The wiser approach is to focus on practices that nurture trust, respect, and spirituality between spouses, ensuring that the marriage remains a source of strength and tranquility.